So today I want to go over one of the Druid builds that I think got the biggest quality of life updates in Season 7, and this is a Hurricane Boulder Druid. And this build is going to be focused around the Dolmen Stone unique amulet, which has the special effect of casting boulder while Hurricane is active, causes the boulders to rotate around you instead. Boulder's damage is increased by up to 40% for each one currently rotating, and you can have 10 active at a time. So you can have up to 400% increased damage, and that's multiplicative, and boulders already deal quite a lot of damage. Now the big quality of life update I was talking about, that when you're using this amulet, you can now cast boulder while moving. So the feel of this build is just significantly better than it used to be. And that brings us to our skill tree. Starting with our basic skills, we're going to be using Claw and then upgrade 1, which increases its attack speed. We will use this every once in a while. It's primarily just for some additional spirit if we need it and to proc additional effects. You can pretty much use any basic that you want, but I just like Claw because you can get that increased attack speed. Then we're going down, we're putting 1 point into Earthen Bulwark, just a big barrier on yourself. Upgrade 1 makes you unstoppable. 1 into Bloodhowl, which is just a heal. Every kill reduces its cooldown by 1 second. Upgrade 2 gives us increased attack speed after using it. Then we're going down, we're putting 1 point into Hurricane, and this is primarily to catch all of our boulders inside of it. Upgrade 1 causes Hurricane to slow enemies. Upgrade 2 makes enemies deal less damage, and this build is super tanky, and things like this are going to make us even more tanky. Then 5 points in a boulder, our main damaging ability, and from one of our legendary aspects, this will also become a core skill, which helps us scale a lot of damage. And then upgrade 1 just adds some CC, and upgrade 2, while you have Fortify, boulder has a 20% increased critical strike chance, which makes our base critical strike chance of this ability pretty high, which is just going to massively increase our damage. Then we're going down for our ultimate, 5 points into Petrify. Petrify stuns everything around you. 5 points into it resets all of our other cooldowns when we use it, and this is primarily so we can always have Hurricane up, or at least majority of the time. Upgrade 1 makes enemies take increased critical strike damage when you use Petrify on them. Bosses take even more damage. And then upgrade 2, when you kill enemies that are petrified, it reduces its cooldown. When you hit a boss with it, its cooldown is also reduced. And then for our passives, 1 into Heart of the Wild to go 3 into Wild Impulse. Your core skills cost more but deal more damage, and since one of our legendary aspects turns our boulder into a core skill, this will work with that. 3 into Eternal Fortitude for increased resistances. 3 into Vigilance, when you use a defensive, we take reduced damage. 3 into Backlash, we deal increased damage after using a defensive, and we do have 2 defensives that will be resetting a lot, so we can have these up a majority of the time. Then 3 into Feral Amplitude, you deal increased damage while healthy and increased damage while above 100% movement speed, which because of one of the affixes on our Dolmen necklace, we can actually have this procced pretty much all of the time. Then we're going down to 3 into Crushing Earth. Our skills deal increased damage to CC'd enemies. Our boulder constantly CCs everything. And then we have 3 into Stone Guard. While you have Fortify for over 50% of your max life, your Earth skills deal increased damage, just more damage. While in Werebear, you receive more healing, but also a massively increased life. 3 into Provocation. While you remain in Werebear form for at least 8 seconds, your next non-defensive skill will overpower. One of the ways we have guaranteed overpowers. 1 into Neurotoxin to get 3 into Envenom. You and your companions deal increased critical strike damage against poisoned enemies, massive damage increase. 3 into Defiant, nature skills deal increased damage to elites. 3 into Natural Disaster, your Earth skills deal increased damage to vulnerable enemies. And then I have 3 into Circle of Life. Anytime we use a nature skill that consumes spirit, heal for 3% of your max life. This will just allow us to heal constantly when casting our boulders. 3 into Catastrophe, use our ultimate, we get massive damage increases. 3 into Quick Shift, shapeshifting into a new animal form gives you damage increase, stacking up really heavily. This will stay with us as long as we're not in human form for 3 seconds. So we use our Bloodhowl and our basic, and we constantly shapeshift to stack up this damage. Then for our capstone, we have Urzine's Strength. You gain massively increased additional max life on Werebear and for 3 seconds after. And while healthy, you deal increased damage and massively increased overpower damage. And our overpower hits are our really big hits, which is generally going to be most of our damage. And then we have our Spirit Boons, starting with Awareness to take reduced damage from elites. We have Iron Feather for massively increased max life, which does help with survivability, but also helps with scaling your overpower damage. Avian Wraith for increased critical strike damage. Then we're using Energize, a lucky hit. Dealing damage has up to a 15% chance to fully restore your spirit. We have another way to fully restore our spirit quite a lot as well, but this is the best thing in this row. And then we have Obsidian Slam. Every 6 casted attack will cause your next Earth skill to overpower. This was changed. This used to be based off kills, so this is much stronger with Season 7, and we're constantly spamming out boulders, so this will be a massive damage increase for proccing overpowers. And then for our mercenaries, we're going to be using Variana primarily for the attack speed increases. So Hysteria, you gain increased attack speed whenever Variana damages something, up to 10%. Then Bloodthirst, you gain 10% attack speed when this is cast. And then we have Bloodlust, you gain 5% more attack speed when Bloodthirst is cast. So just a lot of attack speed increases. And then for our reinforcement, we use Rahir. We're using Bastion. So he pops out with a big shield, makes us take 90% reduced damage, gives us unstoppable. Then you apply to when injured. So when you get low health, he pops out, makes you take massively reduced damage, which will just help you survive quite a lot of near-death experiences. And then we have our witch power, starting with our unique. We're using the cycle, which just spawns flowers everywhere that will deal poison damage to enemies. You can pick them up to heal you. And this really isn't used for anything it actually does in this build. I don't even have it fully upgraded because it really doesn't do much for us besides being a growth and decay. And we needed 3 growth and decay powers total, which is the main reason we're using this. Then we have aura specialization. Your auras gain size and you deal increased critical strike damage to enemies within your aura, which will massively increase our damage. And along with that, we're using aura of siphoning. So this is just a big aura around you that poisons everything and heals you when it deals damage. This applies a poison to everything, so we don't have to worry about that with any other aspect of the build. Then Hex of Flames, a lucky hit, up to a 60% chance to inflict Hex of Flames. And when this is applied to something, whenever they take direct damage, it deals more fire damage to them. If it's a crit, that fire damage is AoE. It can actually deal a decent bit of additional damage, but this is primarily so we have a hex on enemies because we scale our damage more from that from our call gems. Then we have Force of Will. When you kill an enemy, your next 2 overpowers deal increased damage. This keeps stacking, so this is just more overpower damage on top of everything else. Then finally Soul Harvest. So when you use a cooldown, you gain increased primary core stats per surrounding enemy. This lasts for 15 seconds, and while there are enemies around you, the duration does not reduce, so this is just massive willpower increases, which scale all of our ability damage. And then that brings us to our Paragon boards. Like always, I'll primarily be going over the board and glyph selection, but if you want to follow point by point, there'll be a build planner in the description. And like always, make sure you're getting a lot of the things your gear and build needs at that time within your Paragon boards. After you get all of your glyphs and legendary nodes, the main things you're looking for after that is what stats you need. Do you need resistances? Do you need armor? Do you want more max life, or do you want more damage? You can change up your points a lot depending on what you're actually needing. So our first board, we're taking Dominate, gives us increased overpower damage. Then the secondary, when you overpower an enemy, they take increased damage from you. In the legendary, you deal more overpower damage. Then at board 1, we're taking Survival Instinct. While in werebear form, you deal increased damage. That is increased while you're at full life, and you have increased overpower damage up to 25% based on the difference in current life between you and an enemy. So basically, you deal increased damage, more damage when at full life, and as you're getting enemies low, you're dealing more damage to them if you're on high health. It's just a big damage increase. Then the good for taking is Outmatch, which is a buff to rare nodes within range, so more max life, more willpower, more damage than werebear. The secondary, you deal increased physical damage to non-elites and bosses. Then the legendary is just increased damage. Then we're going over to the left, we're taking the Ancestral Guidance board. After spending 75 spirit, you deal increased damage for 5 seconds, and your ultimate deals more damage per spirit cast, but our ultimate doesn't actually deal damage itself. The good for taking is Earth and Sky, a bonus to magic nodes within range, so more damage, more stats. The secondary calls our nature skills to deal increased damage to CC to vulnerable enemies. The legendary makes our nature skills deal increased damage. Then we're going all the way over to the right. The board we're taking is Earthen Devastation. Your Earth skills deal increased critical strike damage, up to 20% of your damage versus crowd controlled bonus, so up to 60% increased critical strike damage. Make sure this is capped out. Massive damage increase. The good for taking is Fang and Claw, another bonus to magic nodes within range, so just more damage stats. And then the secondary, while you are in werewolf or werebear, close enemies take increased damage from you. The legendary is increased damage while shapeshift. Then the final board is Heightened Malice. While poison enemy is nearby, deal increased damage. This is increased for each poison enemy up to 4. Then the glyph for taking is Spirit, increased critical strike damage. The secondary, when you crit an enemy, they take more damage from you, stacking up. The legendary is increased critical strike damage. And that brings us to our gear, starting with our runes and gems. For one of your set, we're using Tam Zal, which casts a non-channel core skill, so our boulder, and you do that 12 times, you gain 20% max life for 6 seconds, so this will proc a decent bit, and again, max life increases our survivability, but also our overpower damage. Then our other set, we're using Store's Offering every 0.3 seconds, casts a non-basic skill to gain the stored offering, so we'll constantly just be using this up, and once we do this enough, our next non basic skill cast, we'll spend all of our primary resource to deal up to 100% increased damage. So basically this just procs on a boulder, deals massively increased damage, and then the rest of your gems are going to be just increased willpower. Make sure one of your rune sets is on your weapon because willpower scales better than the gems you can put on your weapon. And then for our occult gems in our jewelry, we have while you have 3 or more growth and decay witch powers, you gain 8% increased primary core stat, 10% max life, and you're unhindered so you can walk through enemies at all times. This is why we're using the kind of useless unique power. Then we're using your agility, corpse mastery, weapon mastery, wraith, and incarnate skills deal increased direct damage to hex enemies. This is why we're using the fire hex. So we apply that to things, we deal massively increased damage to them because our boulder is still also a wrath skill. And then finally, you deal increased overpower damage to hex enemies. Again, that's why we're taking Hex of Flames, and then we'll just deal massively increased overpower damage to those enemies. But that then brings us to our uniques, and we're using quite a lot of uniques with this build. First off, Dolmen Stone that we went over, this is required for this build to actually work. The stats are also really important. Movement speed while Hurricane is active. We're kind of slow until we have Hurricane, then we're pretty fast. Nature Magic cooldown reduction is really good because it helps reduce our Hurricane so we can have it up more. 6 to Wrath skills and 5 to Crushing Earth, just really big scalers. Then we're using Hunter Zenith. Every 30 seconds you spend in an animal form, your next core skill is a guaranteed to overpower and critically strike and deals up to 60% increased multiplicative damage. Casting a shapeshifting skill reduces the timer by 1 second or 2 seconds if it changes you into a new form. So basically every 30 seconds our next boulder will deal a guaranteed overpower and crit and massively increased damage, and that timer is constantly reduced just by using pretty much any of our abilities. And then its efficacy just massively increase a lot of our passives. And for our final normal unique, we have Vasily's Prayer. Your Earth skills are now also werebear skills and fortify you for up to 5% of your max life. This is massive because this gives us all the fortify we need, and this allows our boulder to be a werebear skill, which is obviously very important for many different reasons. Then for our 2 mythic uniques, we have Shroud of False Death, and there's 2 reasons we're using this. It gives +1 to all passives, which you could probably remove everything else from this item, and +1 to all passives would probably still make it be the best in slots. But then it also gives +2 all stats, a massive increase to all stats, which allows us to get pretty much every single bonus effect to every rare node in our Paragon boards, which is a lot of stat increases. Max life is also nice. Resource generation actually helps with this build a bit. And then actually with a build that's a bit slower when we're out of combat, the stealth with movement speed is actually decently helpful. Then finally, we have Ring of Starless Sky. Spending your primary resource reduces your resource cost of your skills and increases your damage by 10% up to 50%. And the stats are decent. Crit strike chance, attack speed, lucky a chance, 4 to core skills. All the stats on this are actually pretty good. And then the special is also really good as well. So this is a very, very strong item. But then that brings us to our legendary aspects, and on your weapon, your core skills deal up to 150% increased damage based on your fortify, massive damage increase to everything based off our fortify, which will always have pretty much maxed out. Then our other offensive aspect is boulder is also a core skill and costs 40 spirit to cast, dealing up to 130% of normal damage. So boulder deals more damage, is a core skill, so scales with a lot more, and costs 40 spirit to cast. So it just turns it into a core skill and increases its damage. Then on our legs, you have a 20% increased crowd control duration. While enemies are unstoppable, meaning you CC them enough to where they can't be CC'd anymore, you deal increased damage to them, so pretty big. This build is heavily focused on getting a lot of CC because boulder just constantly CCs everything it hits. We'll be CCing basically everything. Then on our boots, while Hurricane is active, have +5 ranks to your shapeshifting skills, and that's massive scaling. You have Hurricane active almost 100% of the time, and +5 to all skills, or at least all of our skills because they're pretty much all shapeshifting, is really big for scaling. Now, because this build has a lot of uniques, we only have 4 items to really modify, but there are a few important pieces within these items. First off, on your gloves, you want the lucky hit, which gives you a chance to make enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds. This is how we apply vulnerable. So you need these on your gloves. This is the main thing. And then also for temperings, you're going to want Hurricane duration increase on, I think, 2 items. I currently don't have it on 2 items. If you have everything fully upgraded, I think you only need it on one item. There is a weird breakpoint where you can keep Hurricane 100% of the time if you have Hurricane duration increased enough. But I think if you fully upgrade, you should be able to only need it on one item. If it's not good enough, you can change one of the temperings on your boots or legs from Petrified duration to Hurricane duration. Just keep in mind, it was actually kind of hard to get the rolls between those two. And then on your weapon for its normal affix roll, you really need the lucky hit, which is a chance to restore a certain percent of your primary resource. You're using a two-handed, so this will very easily give you more than your full spirit bar when you get this as a proc, and this just helps you constantly refresh your spirit when you need it. And then tempering, chance for boulder projectiles to cast twice. That's also really massive. That'll make sure you always have 10 boulders up at a time or help you get to that point much more quickly. But that's the entirety of the Season 7 boulder build, and this build is incredibly fun to play. You do have to get used to it because your boulders aren't directly in your melee range. You kind of have to be a little bit away from different enemies, at least ones that aren't really big. But it's super fun to play because you can now cast boulders while active. You're pretty fast because you always have Hurricane up. You're ultra tanky at all times, and because of our occult gem, you're unhindered, so you can constantly walk through enemies. So it just feels like you're walking destruction. One of the strongest Druid builds in the season. I know you can pretty easily get over 100 pit levels with this, so you can max out your glyphs as well, so you can do absolutely everything in the end game. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.